everyone, this is Christina from Pretty and Pink Supply, and today we're going to cover all things resin. We are going to talk about safety. We're going to cover the difference between AB resin and UV resin. We're going to talk about mix-ins like clays, glitters, dyes, and mica powders. We're also going to talk about cleanup and some tips and tricks when trying to get rid of your bubbles, and just all around working with resin. Okay, first up, we're going to cover safety. Safety is huge when working with resin. You always want to make sure to work in a well-ventilated area. You want to have a door or window open and a fan going just to keep your airflow moving. You want to make sure that you're working with a mask. Respirator masks are important for working with resin. Just because it says non-toxic, when you do mix the two together, it does have a chemical reaction, and with that, there's going to be fumes. So these types of masks are great. I will link this one in the description below. There's other ones that are a little bit smaller that you can use. There's all kinds on Amazon, so there's lots of great masks out there for working with resin. Same thing with UV. UV, it does have a little bit of a smell where AB does not. It's a low odor, but the same thing, it does have chemicals that you do not want to be breathing in. Gloves, nitrile gloves are great for working with resin. You do not want to get this stuff on your hands. It's really sticky, kind of like Gorilla Glue sticky, and it's hard to get off. And at the same time, it can cause irritation to your skin. Everybody reacts different to things, so you want to just be cautious of that type of stuff. Okay, next we're going to talk about the difference between AB resin and UV resin. So AB resin is just two parts and you are mixing them together in a 1-to-1 ratio. With AB resin, you need to make sure that you mix for at least 3 minutes for it to be able to cure properly. So if you want it to harden right, then it needs to be mixed properly. Just do a slow motion mix. And then you're gonna see some bubbles with that. If you let it set aside for maybe 5 minutes, your bubbles will go away. So keep that in mind when working with AB resin. UV resin, and AB resin has a low odor, where UV resins normally have a smell. They have some type of chemically smell. So that's why you always wanna wear a mask with working with either of them, but this one definitely has more of a smell. UV resin does cure very quickly, where the AB resin takes at least 36 hours to cure. So you gotta wait a longer length of time for it to be ready, but you can get a lot more done with AB resin, so it's great for like larger projects, where UV resin is better for like smaller projects that you're working on because it's cures so quickly, but you do need to cure it under UV light. So that could be a UV lamp, or it could even be outside in the sun. It just needs direct sunlight. Keep in mind, if you are working with UV resin, you want to always make sure if you're working outside with it, because a lot of people, you think well-ventilated areas, you work outside. That's great, but keep in mind when you're working with this, you do not want the sun touching it, because as soon as it comes out of the bottle, it's going to start to harden. So you want to kind of be in a shaded area or somewhere where it's not going to cause it to start hardening immediately, because as soon as that sun gets on it, it's going to start to harden. That's why it's in the black bottle to block out any light. Okay, with AB resin, it just takes longer. So that's the huge difference between it. You also get more for your money with AB resin. You can also do more mix-ins with AB resin, where with UV, if you add too much dye or too much glitters or even too many clay, well, not necessarily clays, but anything, if you overdo the amount of mix-ins into your UV, it does mess with the overall structure, I guess you could say, of your UV resin, and so it may not cure correctly when you put too much of any of these things. Where AB resin, it can still mess with it, but it works a little bit better with these type of things. Also, because UV resin needs light to cure, when you put too much of this type of stuff in, it makes it more opaque, which means that it's less see-through, so the light can't get in, so it won't cure correctly, and it'll be more bendy. So those are just a few things to keep in mind when working with either of these, but they both work great, and it's really just preference and whatever type of project you're working on. Something that always happens with resin is bubbles. You're gonna always have bubbles, it just happens. But a good way to get rid of bubbles, like I mentioned before with your AB resin, when you mix it, it's gonna have bubbles just because you're mixing and air is getting in there. But if you do let it set aside, it'll clear up and it'll look great. Another way to do it is you can get one of these, like a little mixing cup. Silicone cups are great because they're easy to clean up, but we'll talk about that at the end. So you want to do your mix-ins with your resin in a little cup, and then Some people do their heat guns over their molds, but it tends to make the molds start to like warp and bend and get kind of just like not good. It kind of messes with your silicone molds. So a good tip is to do your mix-ins in your little cups first, okay? So if I have my UV resin or the AB, I would just pour it in here however much I think I may need. And then I would add in my powders or my dyes, and I would mix it up so it's nice and like mixed together. And then I would get my heat gun and just go over it for maybe 10 seconds. Okay, as soon as you're done with that and you just mix it a little more, you're gonna see all those bubbles disappear, which is great. It helps to get rid of the bubbles, and then you can pour. So I like to do that. It always works great for me, and it doesn't mess with my mold. If you have to pour first, if you're doing some type of project where you need to pour your resin into your mold first, then you can quickly run over it with a heat gun. I would just do it fast so you're not messing up your mold. And one last tip when working with UV resin is I like to just hold my bottle upside down just for a few seconds to allow all the resin to go to the bottom, and then that allows the bubbles to rise to the top, so when you start squeezing it out, there's less bubbles. So just a few tips that I've learned with working with the different types of resin and that have helped me to get rid of bubbles, and they work great. So hopefully they help. Okay, molds. So we want to use silicone molds when working with resin. And there's normally two different types. There are colored solid type molds, and then there's going to be transparent molds. The transparent molds are great for working with either AB or UV, especially UV, because you can easily flip your mold over after you've cured the front side, and you can flip it over and cure your back side as well. Remember that your UV resin needs the UV rays to be able to cure correctly. So you want to be able to flip it over, and you can't do that necessarily with these. Some people have said they've been able to use UV with this, and maybe that's possible. I haven't tried it with these yet, but the most important thing is light. So I'm guessing if you were doing more of like a see-through type resin or UV resin, like if it was easy for the light to get through all the way to the bottom, then it may cure. It's probably going to take longer though with these type of molds. So something to keep in mind when working with different types of molds. But with the UV, we always like to flip it over. So just a few tips: flip over and then try and use the clear transparent type molds when working with the UV. Okay, so the best thing about working with resin is all the fun dyes and glitters and mica powders that you can mix in with them and get totally creative. And that's what I have the most fun with, is coming up with like fun little themes or just different mix-ins for them. So first we're gonna talk about glitters. You can use glitters in your resin. You can mix them in. I normally like to put my resin in my cup first, then I add in my glitter, and then I mix. Okay, you can do it either way, it'll work the same. With mica powders, so mica powders almost give you like a pearlescent metallic look to your resin, and it looks so pretty. They're so great for coloring your resin, but these work great. And same thing with these, you're gonna have a solid color, but for both of these, you do not wanna use more than 10% of however much resin you have in your cup or whatever you're mixing for your overall project. So about 10% is great to use for either of these. You do not wanna overdo it with the dyes, just because it'll change the consistency of your resin and then it may not cure correctly. When you are working with mica powder, to be able to tell how it'll look once it's cured, if you are mixing it and say you have, I don't have any sticks here with me, but if you're using like a popsicle stick or a silicone stick and you kind of just pull it up out of your cup a little bit, you can see it running down, and that'll show you how transparent or opaque it'll be once it's cured. Because when it's in the cup and it's all together, it may look super dark, and you might think, oh, this is gonna be great, this is how it's gonna look when I pour it in my mold. But if you lift it and you see once it like hits the light a little bit, that's gonna show you how it's gonna look once it is actually cured. So that's a good way to kind of tell, do I need to put more powder? Do I want it darker? So just a good little rule of thumb is to kind of check it that way. With the dyes, so I like to start with 1 drop, not more than that, and then I mix it up, see how transparent looking it is, and then I add more that way. And like I said, you don't want a ton of dye just because it'll mess with the consistency and you don't want it to end up not curing correctly, okay? Especially with the resin it messes more with, so because of the light not being able to get through. So just a few things to keep in mind when working with these. Clays are great to work with. They look so fun, so pretty when they're mixed in with your resin. I think that is everything as far as mix-ins, but they all look so pretty and you can come up with so many fun ideas when working with them. Okay, last we're gonna talk about cleanup. So cleanup is huge because you don't wanna leave this stuff sitting out and it's just a mess. Especially if you like drop it or you have a spill. The easiest way to clean up, and I learned this, a few people have told me this and I've tried it out and I love doing this, is I have a thing of wipes just sitting on the side, just baby wipes. If you're gonna use the baby wipes for your project of resin, you do not wanna use them for anything else. Just keep them with your resin stuff and that's it, that's all you use them for. But I just keep them on the side, and if I have a small spill or something like that, I can grab one and easily clean it up, and it cleans up perfectly, like just wipes right up. So those are great for keeping nearby for spills, or if you pour in your mold and it maybe has like where it's coming out on the side a little bit, you can kind of clean up that, which is great, and then you won't have excess like resin once it cures and you have to like cut it off or anything like that. So that's a good tip, is the baby wipes. And then I also like to use a silicone mat. The mats are great to keep under for when you're pouring or anything like that, and that's what I said, like with the wipe, you can just wipe it up off of this. Also, if you do not wipe it up right away and it cures, it'll just pill right up. So the silicone mats are great for working with your resin. Silicone cups are also another thing that I think are so great to work with, whereas the plastic ones, they're just a little bit harder to clean, but they can still work just as well. But I do like to use these just because they can cure and you can pill it. You can pill them out once they're cured. Or you can take, like I said, you can take your wipe. You always want to make sure that you're wearing your gloves. You can take your wipe and you can, with your gloves on, you can wipe out the inside, get it all cleaned up, and then you can use some soap and water and you can clean them up that way. You need to make sure before you use soap and water in your sink that they're completely cleaned out, because you don't want this stuff going down your drain because it will cure. So always remember that. Always clean out first, clean it. You can even use a napkin. Another thing that you can use to clean up is rubbing alcohol. That cleans up the resin great from your cups as well. If you are using UV resin you can just throw under your UV light, or you can throw it outside and it'll cure in a few minutes, and you can just pill it out and toss it. So cleanup is very easy if you follow any of those steps. But like I said, you always want to have something under your workspace when you're working. That way it's an easy cleanup at the end. If you get glitter on your silicone mat, because silicone is sticky, so stuff's going to tend to stick to it, you can just get some masking tape. I like to get tape and just go over it and clean it up that way after all my resin is off. I think that's everything. I think we've covered everything. And if you guys have any tips that maybe I didn't mention, or any other things that maybe I missed, go ahead and leave them in the comments below, and I'd love to hear them. I'd love to chat about them with you guys. And thank you so much, as always, for watching. And if you like what you saw today, definitely like and subscribe to our channel.